sitting in a dress that cost 3 paychecks, humiliation, burns your throat as your date sneers, "I don't do fat girls," and walks out. Before the first tear can even fall, the city's most dangerous crime lord slides into his empty seat, smirking. "His loss," he whispers. "My treasure." Tension hung heavy over the candlelit tables of Lumiere Chicago's most exclusive French bistro. Harper Hayes sat perfectly still, her knuckles turning white as she gripped the stem of her water glass. She was a beautiful woman carrying lush, undeniable curves that she had spent years learning to dress, love, and own. Tonight she wore a deep emerald wrap dress that accentuated her hips and a perfectly applied ruby lipstick. She had felt like $1 million walking into the restaurant. That feeling hadn't lasted 10 minutes. Across from her stood Chadwick Hastings. Chad was a junior VP at a downtown finance firm, a man whose entire personality revolved around his gym membership, his protein macros, and his relentless vanity. They had met on a dating app where Harper had been completely transparent about her plus-size figure. Yet as Chad's eyes darted nervously toward the entrance, where 2 of his frat bro colleagues had just walked in, his entire demeanor had shifted from mildly uninterested to openly hostile. "Look, Harper," Chad said, his voice carrying just enough volume to draw the attention of the adjacent tables. "I thought your profile pictures were just, poorly angled. I didn't realize you were actually this heavy. Todd and Brent just walked in, and honestly, I have an image to maintain. I can't be seen sitting across from a fat chick at a place like this. I'm leaving. You can cover your own water." He didn't wait for a response. Chad tossed his napkin onto the table, adjusted his Rolex, and briskly walked out the side exit to avoid his friends. Harper sat frozen. The clinking of silverware around her seemed to amplify. She could feel the pitying stares burning into her skin. A seasoned waiter hovered near the service station, holding a menu, clearly unsure if he should approach the humiliated woman left behind at table 4. Harper's chest tightened. She took a slow, jagged breath, commanding her tear ducts to hold the line. "Do not cry in public," she told herself. "Do not let a miserable, shallow finance bro ruin your dignity." Just as she reached for her purse to make a quiet, dignified exit, the temperature in the room seemed to plummet. The low hum of jazz music and polite chatter abruptly died. Harper looked up through her lashes to see the maitre d' aggressively backing away his face, pale with raw panic. The guests at the neighboring tables immediately dropped their gazes to their plates, suddenly terrified to look anywhere else. A man was walking toward her table. He moved with the terrifying, predatory grace of a panther navigating a jungle. He wore a bespoke charcoal suit that clung to a broad, heavily muscled frame. His dark hair was immaculately styled, but it was his face that demanded attention. Sharp, aristocratic features, marred only by a thin, faded scar running along his jawline. His eyes were the color of crushed winter ice, cold and entirely uncompromising. Harper recognized him immediately. Anyone who read the local papers or worked in the city knew who he was. Nathaniel Cross. He was the undisputed head of the Cross family, a ruthless crime syndicate that had maintained an iron grip on the city's underground for 3 generations. Whispers said Nathaniel owned half the politicians in the state, and that crossing him resulted in a permanent watery grave in Lake Michigan. To Harper's utter bewilderment, Nathaniel Cross didn't walk past her. He stopped right at table 4. Without breaking eye contact with Harper, Nathaniel reached out and pulled back the heavy mahogany chair Chad had vacated just moments prior. He sat down, unbuttoning his suit jacket with fluid elegance, and crossed one long leg over the other. Behind him, a hulking man with a broken nose, his right-hand enforcer Declan, took up a silent post near the pillar, crossing his arms and glaring at anyone foolish enough to stare. You're breathing perfectly fine, yet your heart is beating like a trapped bird, Nathaniel observed. His voice was a rich, dark baritone that sent an involuntary shiver down Harper's spine. Don't let a coward steal your peace. Harper swallowed hard, her throat dry. I think you have the wrong table, mister. Cross. Nathaniel's lips curved into a faint, dangerous smirk. I never sit at the wrong table, Miss Hayes. Harper blinked, shock momentarily replacing her lingering humiliation. You know my name. I make it my business to know everything that happens in my city, Nathaniel replied smoothly. He raised 2 fingers. The maître d' practically sprinted over a bottle of Dom Perignon, already in his trembling hands. Nathaniel didn't even look at the man as the champagne was poured. I saw what just happened. Nathaniel continued, his icy eyes locking onto Harper's warm brown ones. He leaned forward slightly, the scent of expensive sandalwood and dark tobacco wafting across the table. I watched a pathetic weak boy run away from a queen because he was terrified of her substance. Harper's cheeks flushed hotly. She had spent her entire life fielding backhanded compliments about her weight, but sitting across from a notorious mob boss who was staring at her as if she were the most delectable thing on the menu was entirely unprecedented. He said I was too fat. Harper said, the words slipping out before she could filter them. She immediately wanted to sink under the floorboards. Why am I complaining about a bad date to a mafia boss? Nathaniel's expression darkened, a flash of genuine, terrifying rage briefly cracking his composed facade. He is a blind fool, Nathaniel said softly, though the menace in his tone made the glassware vibrate. A boy looks for bones. A real man, craves softness. He craves a woman who fills his hands and warms his bed. A woman with an appetite for life. He reached across the table, his large, calloused fingers lightly brushing against Harper's trembling hand. His loss, my treasure. Harper's breath hitched. The casual, confident way he claimed her sent a rush of heat straight to her core. Why are you sitting here? Harper finally asked, finding a scrap of her usual courage. Men like you don't play knight in shining armor for random women with broken hearts. You underestimate my appreciation for art, Harper, Nathaniel countered seamlessly. He signaled to the hovering waiter. We will have the Chateaubriand, medium rare, the truffle pomme puree, and whatever your richest, most decadent chocolate dessert is. He looked back at Harper. Unless you prefer something else. That sounds fine, she whispered. For the next 2 hours, the deadliest man in Chicago treated a plus-size archivist like absolute royalty. Nathaniel Cross was fiercely intelligent, steering the conversation away from his illicit empire, and instead asking Harper about her work at the Historical Society. He listened intently, his cold eyes softening as she passionately described her love for preserving old manuscripts. He fed her bites of perfectly cooked steak from his own fork, completely ignoring the terrified whispers of the restaurant's elite patrons. By the time the chocolate soufflé arrived, Harper had entirely forgotten about Chadwick Hastings. She was intoxicated, not by the champagne, but by the sheer overwhelming gravity of Nathaniel Cross's attention. As the evening drew to a close, Nathaniel stood and offered her his arm. Allow me to escort you home. Harper knew the smart thing to do was to politely decline, call an Uber, and never look at a man connected to organized crime again. But as she looked at Nathaniel's extended arm, she realized she was done playing it safe. She slipped her hand through his arm, leaning into his solid warmth. I'd like that. The cool Chicago wind whipped through Harper's hair as they exited Lumiere. Waiting at the curb was a massive armor-plated Lincoln Navigator, idling with a low, menacing growl. Declan immediately stepped forward, opening the heavy rear door and offering Harper a respectful nod, a stark contrast to the way Chad had treated her just hours ago. Harper slid into the plush leather interior, Nathaniel following closely behind her. The cabin was a cocoon of luxury, insulated perfectly from the noise of the city. As the SUV pulled seamlessly into the traffic, heading toward Wicker Park, the reality of the situation began to settle over Harper. She was sitting in the back of a mob boss's car. "You're overthinking," Nathaniel murmured, breaking the quiet. He reached into a concealed compartment, withdrawing a crystal decanter of amber liquid. He poured a small amount into a glass, swirling it thoughtfully. "I can hear the gears grinding in your head from over here." Harper turned to face him, the dim streetlights illuminating the sharp angles of his face. "Can you blame me? 2 hours ago, I was just a girl getting publicly dumped. Now I'm in a bulletproof SUV with Nathaniel Cross. Forgive me if I'm trying to figure out the catch." Nathaniel took a slow sip of his bourbon. He let out a dark, velvety chuckle that rumbled in the small space. "You are refreshingly blunt." He noted his eyes trailing down the curve of her throat to the swell of her cleavage before returning to her eyes. "There is no catch, Harper. But there is a truth." He set the glass down and shifted closer to her, the sheer size of him making the spacious back seat feel suddenly intimate. "I was not at Lumiere by accident tonight," Nathaniel confessed softly. "I was there for Chadwick Hastings." Harper froze, her eyes widening. "Chad, what does a mid-level finance bro have to do with your business?" "Your charming date." Nathaniel said the word charming, dripping with venom, as a side hustle. "For the last 6 months, he has been acting as a digital launderer for one of my legitimate shell companies. He was supposed to be moving money through offshore crypto exchanges. Instead, the greedy little idiot thought he was smarter than the Cross family. He started skimming." Harper gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. "He stole from you $3 million. Nathaniel confirmed, his face entirely blank, which was somehow more terrifying than if he had looked angry. "My men finally traced the missing funds this morning. I knew he had a reservation at Lumiere tonight. I went there to personally drag him out by his collar, strip him of everything he owns, and teach him the consequences of stealing from me." Harper felt a sudden icy knot of dread form in her stomach. But you didn't. You let him walk away." Nathaniel reached out, his knuckles lightly grazing Harper's soft cheek. The contrast between his lethal reputation and his gentle touch made her breath catch. "I walked into that restaurant ready to break his legs." Nathaniel admitted, his voice dropping an octave. "And then I saw him sitting across from you. I watched him look at a woman who radiates beauty, warmth, and grace, and I watched him tear you down to soothe his own pathetic insecurities." He leaned closer, his forehead almost resting against hers. "Watching him break your heart angered me far more than the $3 million he stole," Nathaniel whispered fiercely. "I decided in that moment that a quick beating was too good for him. I decided to make a point." The SUV smoothly rolled to a stop in front of Harper's modest apartment building. Declan killed the engine, but remained facing forward, giving them total privacy. "What kind of point?" Harper asked, her voice trembling slightly, though not entirely from fear. "The kind he will never forget," Nathaniel replied. He pulled back slightly, his eyes burning with a dark, possessive fire. "Get some sleep, Harper. Tomorrow will be a very interesting day." He didn't try to kiss her. He didn't push boundaries. He simply instructed Declan to walk her all the way up to her third-floor apartment and wait until she locked the deadbolt. Harper spent the entire night tossing and turning, her mind replaying the feeling of Nathaniel's calloused fingers on her skin and the terrifying reality of his words. The next morning, a Tuesday, Harper dragged herself to the university archives. She buried herself in a stack of 19th-century ledgers, trying to convince herself that last night was a fever dream, a bizarre cinematic glitch in her otherwise ordinary life. At exactly 11:15 a.m., the heavy oak doors of the archive reading room violently swung open. Harper dropped her pen, startled. Standing in the doorway was Chadwick Hastings, but it wasn't the arrogant, perfectly groomed Chad from the restaurant. This man was a shattered shell. His expensive Armani suit was torn and covered in dirt. His left eye was swollen completely shut, blooming with a grotesque purple bruise. His lip was split, and he was trembling violently, his eyes darting around the quiet room like a hunted animal. "Harper!" he gasped, practically stumbling over his own feet as he rushed toward her desk. "Chad, my God, what happened to you?" Harper stood up, instinctively backing away from the frantic man. Chad collapsed against her desk, ignoring the fragile historical documents scattered across it. He looked up at her with his one good eye completely devoid of the sneering superiority he had wielded just yesterday. Tears were streaming down his face, mixing with the blood on his cheek. "You have to call him." Chad sobbed, his voice cracking hysterically. "Please, Harper, you have to call him and tell him to call them off." Harper's heart hammered against her ribs. She knew exactly who he was talking about. "Chad, I don't know what you're—" "Don't lie to me," Chad pleaded, dropping to his knees, right there in the middle of the library. He grabbed the hem of her cardigan, burying his face in his hands. "They were waiting for me in the parking garage this morning. 4 guys. They took my car, they drained my bank accounts, and they beat the hell out of me." He looked up, his expression one of sheer terror. "They told me they were going to put me in the river by midnight," Chad whimpered, practically hyperventilating. "But then the big guy, the one with the broken nose, Declan," Harper murmured involuntarily. "Yes, Declan," Chad cried. "He stopped them. He held a phone to my ear, and Nathaniel Cross was on the other line. He told me that my debt was no longer a matter of money." Chad swallowed hard, looking at Harper, not with disgust, but with absolute reverent fear. "He told me my life belongs to the girl in the red dress," Chad whispered, fresh tears spilling over. "He said if you forgive me, he lets me live. If you don't, I'm dead by midnight. Please, Harper, I was a jerk. I was a shallow, stupid jerk. I'm so sorry. Please save my life." Harper stood, frozen, looking down at the man who had publicly humiliated her over the size of her waist, now kneeling at her feet, begging for his very existence. Nathaniel hadn't just defended her honor. He had literally handed her the scales of justice, placing the life of her abuser squarely into her soft, manicured hands. The power trip was intoxicating and terrifying. Before Harper could even formulate a response, her cell phone resting on the corner of the desk lit up. The caller ID was a restricted number. She slowly picked it up, pressing it to her ear. Did the rat deliver his apology? Nathaniel's dark, smooth voice purred through the speaker. Harper looked down at Chad, who was sobbing pathetically on the floor. "He did," Harper said, her voice remarkably steady. "Good," Nathaniel replied. "Now, little bird, what would you like me to do with him?" Silence stretched across the university library, broken only by Chad's pathetic, ragged breathing. Harper looked down at the man who had reduced her to tears just 24 hours ago over the size of her waist. Now he was a hollowed-out shell, begging a woman he deemed too fat to be seen with for his very survival. Through the phone pressed to her ear, Nathaniel's breathing was slow, calm, and utterly lethal. He was waiting. "I don't want him dead," Harper said softly, her voice steady. Chad let out a loud, shuddering gasp of relief, practically collapsing onto the floorboards. "Are you sure, my treasure?" Nathaniel asked, a hint of disappointment coloring his smooth baritone. "He disrespected you. He stole from me. Men have vanished into the concrete foundations of this city for a fraction of those offenses. "Death is too quick," Harper replied, her eyes narrowing as she stared at the designer suit Chad had undoubtedly bought with stolen money. "He cares about his image, his status, his pristine, perfect little life. Take it all. Strip him of his job, his penthouse, his bank accounts. I want him working a minimum wage job where he comes home smelling like garbage, knowing that a woman he thought was beneath him is the only reason he gets to breathe." A deep, dark chuckle rumbled through the phone speaker. It was a sound that made Harper's toes curl. Brilliant, symmetrical, merciless. Nathaniel praised the raw admiration in his voice, sending heat straight to her cheeks. "As my queen commands." He gave a brief order to Declan, who was waiting outside. Within seconds, 2 of Nathaniel's men entered the library, grabbed Chad by his expensive lapels, and dragged him out the back door. Chad didn't fight. He wept with gratitude. That afternoon marked the beginning of Harper's descent into a world she had only ever read about in pulp novels. Nathaniel Cross did not court women. He conquered them. But with Harper, his conquest was surprisingly tender. He showered her with a terrifying level of devotion. When they attended a high society gala the following weekend, Harper wore a custom-tailored scarlet gown that hugged every curve of her lush, full figure. Whenever a socialite or a corrupt businessman dared to cast a questioning glance at the mob boss and his plus-size companion, a single icy glare from Nathaniel was enough to make them look away in sheer terror. "You belong here," Nathaniel murmured against her ear. That night, his large hands resting possessively on her wide hips as they stood on the balcony of his lakefront estate. "You are built like a goddess from the Renaissance. Abundant. Beautiful. Mine." But life at the top of Chicago's underworld was not just silk sheets and whispered praises. The Cross family's dominance was being quietly challenged. Salvatore Moretti, a vicious rival from the South Side, had recently formed an alliance with Thomas Weaver, a heavily corrupt city alderman. Weaver had been secretly fast-tracking zoning laws to seize Nathaniel's legitimate warehouse properties under the guise of eminent domain, effectively cutting off the Cross family's most lucrative smuggling routes. Nathaniel was spending later nights in his study, his sharp features tight with stress, plotting a violent war that would undoubtedly drench the city streets in blood. Harper wanted to help. She wasn't a killer, nor was she a gangster, but she possessed something far more dangerous, a brilliant mind and unrestricted access to the city's oldest, most classified historical archives. Late one Tuesday night, after Nathaniel had left for a tense sit-down with his capos, Harper bypassed the security protocols at the Historical Society. She pulled heavy, dust-covered municipal ledgers from the 1920s, cross-referencing property deeds, old bootlegging routes, and forgotten city council mandates. At 3 a.m. she found it. The twist was almost too perfect. Alderman Thomas Weaver's great-grandfather, a supposedly upstanding judge, had stolen the very land Weaver was currently using as leverage against Nathaniel. The theft involved forged documents, a murdered dock worker, and millions in unpaid back taxes that by law would render the Weaver family entirely bankrupt and politically ruined if exposed. Harper didn't just have blackmail, she had the nuclear codes to Weaver's entire legacy. The trap was sprung before Harper even realized she was in danger. She had just slipped the damning 1924 property deed into a protective folder when the heavy double doors of the archive room clicked shut, the locks engaged with a heavy metallic thud. Harper froze. Standing in the shadows of the genealogy section were 3 men. They didn't wear the tailored charcoal suits of the Cross family. They wore scuffed leather jackets, their faces grim and scarred. Salvatore Moretti's men. "Give us the folder, sweetheart," the lead man growled, pulling a suppressed pistol from his waistband. Weaver tipped us off that Cross's new girl was poking around where she shouldn't be. Hand it over, and maybe we just break your hands instead of putting a bullet in that pretty little head. Harper backed away, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs. She clutched the folder to her chest. If Moretti got this document, Nathaniel would be forced into a bloody street war. He could be killed. "You're not getting it," Harper said, trying to project a confidence she didn't feel. "Wrong answer, fatty." The thug sneered, raising the gun. The insult barely registered, because in the next millisecond, the reinforced glass skylight above them shattered into 1,000,000 glittering diamonds. Declan dropped from the ceiling like a 200-pound cinder block, landing squarely on the gunman. The sickening crunch of bone echoed through the silent library as Declan systematically, ruthlessly dismantled the three men. It took less than 40 seconds. When the dust settled, Moretti's men were unconscious, bleeding out on the linoleum. The library doors burst open. Nathaniel strode into the room. His usually immaculate suit rumpled his eyes, blazing with a frantic, terrifying panic. When he saw Harper standing unharmed behind the desk, the lethal tension in his shoulders shattered. He crossed the room in 3 long strides, pulling her into a desperate, crushing embrace. "I swear to God," Nathaniel breathed heavily into her hair, his massive hands mapping the soft curves of her back, assuring himself she was real and safe. "I will burn this entire city to the bedrock for daring to touch you." "I'm fine, Nathaniel," Harper whispered, tears of adrenaline finally spilling over. She pulled back slightly, her hands trembling as she held up the manila folder. "I got it. I got Weaver." Nathaniel looked at the century-old document, then back at the beautiful, brilliant, voluptuous woman who had just risked her life to protect his empire. "You went into the fire for me," he murmured, absolute awe lacing his tone. "You gave me my dignity back," Harper replied, her brown eyes locking fiercely onto his icy ones. "It was time I protected yours." The fallout was swift, silent, and devastating. Nathaniel did not start a street war. He didn't have to. Armed with Harper's archival discoveries, Nathaniel arranged a private meeting with Alderman Weaver. Faced with absolute financial and political ruin, Weaver immediately folded. He resigned from office, citing health reasons, and transferred the disputed warehouse deeds directly to the Cross family. Without his political shield, Salvatore Moretti was left utterly exposed. 2 days later, Moretti was found tied to a chair in an abandoned meatpacking plant, breathing but broken, forced into early retirement under Nathaniel's boot. The balance of the city was restored not by bullets, but by a plus-size archivist who knew how to read the past. 6 months later, Harper stood in the grand foyer of a newly renovated 4-story brownstone in the Gold Coast district. It was breathtaking. Vaulted ceilings, imported Italian marble, and endless rows of custom mahogany bookshelves. "Do you like it?" Nathaniel asked, stepping up behind her. He wrapped his arms around her lush waist, pulling her back against his solid chest, pressing a soft kiss to the side of her neck. "It's beautiful," Harper whispered, leaning into his warmth. "Who did you buy it for?" "For the director of the newly established Cross Historical Foundation," Nathaniel said, smoothly turning her around to face him. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a velvet box, snapping it open to reveal a staggering, flawless, emerald-cut diamond ring. "Chadwick Hastings looked at you and saw a flaw," Nathaniel said, his voice thick with emotion, dropping to one knee right there on the marble floor. "I looked at you and saw a queen, an empire builder, a woman who fills my arms, my heart, and my life. Marry me, Harper. Let me spend the rest of my days worshipping the treasure I found." Tears streamed down Harper's face, but this time they were tears of pure, unadulterated triumph. She was no longer the girl crying in a restaurant over a boy's cruelty. She was the woman who commanded the shadows of Chicago. Yes, she breathed. Nathaniel slipped the ring onto her finger, standing to pull her into a searing, passionate kiss. In the grand game of power and respect, the cruel, shallow boys always lose, and the kings, they always protect their treasure. If this story of sweet revenge and mafia romance kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button, subscribe to our channel for more thrilling, real-life inspired dramas